Peace family, this is the Draped Maniac podcast, and I'm Ayapo Yapa, the HDIC, that is the head Draptomaniac in charge, and we're here to have conversations on how to get off this plantation. In February of this year, 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery was murdered by two race soldiers while he was innocently taking a jog. As of today, nearly 3 months later, the creatures responsible are just now being charged with the murder. Whether they're convicted or not remains to be seen. I'm starting off talking about the murder, but this podcast is not about this particular murder.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that you listeners are listening to the Draptomaniac podcast on doayamedia.com. You are, right?
There are plenty of commentators who are talking about this specifically. I just want to say, as I always say, it happened yesterday, it's happening today, and sadly, it will happen again tomorrow. In an August 16th, 2019 Los Angeles Times article titled, "Getting Killed by Police is the Leading Cause of Death for Young Black Men in America," it states, about 1 in 1,000 black men and boys in America can expect to die at the hands of police, according to a new analysis of death involving law enforcement officers. That makes them 2.5 times more likely than white men and boys to die during an encounter with cops. The numbers are actually far higher and more staggering than that. There are studies that show black people are up to 6 times more likely to be shot by police than white people. And as we have seen in the past, there is no posture we can take that will prevent us from being shot. Hands up, hands down, walking away, walking toward them, standing still, moving, facing them, back to them, running toward them, running from them, hands in our pockets, hands out of our pockets, hands on the steering wheel, hands off the steering wheel. Or in the case of Charles Kinsley, laying on the ground with no weapon in his hands and his arms stretched straight up in the air. And he was still shot by Officer John Alita, who was ultimately charged with a misdemeanor for nearly murdering this man. We are also in constant danger of being murdered by non-deputized race soldiers who we encounter when they're roaming to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth in it, as in the case of Trayvon Martin and recently Ahmaud Arbery. We had Botham Jean, who was murdered by ex-police officer Amber Geiger, where she was comforted by a black officer of the court, the black judge, and finally, probably most distastefully, the brother of the man she murdered, and then sentenced to a paltry 10 years. Likely, she'll be out in 5. Dylan Roof murders 9 black people at a Bible study, and the police let him have it his way by stopping at Burger King on the way to the station, while Freddie Gray died of a severed neck when he was thrown in the back of a paddy wagon and jostled around on a rough ride to the station, allegedly for carrying an illegal knife, which was later discovered to actually have been a legal knife. The Baltimore police responsible for the murder were never charged. Sandra Bland's family received $1.9 million. The family of Philando Castile received $3 million. The family of Tamir Rice received $6 million. Freddie Gray's family received $6.4 million. The family of Gregory Hill, who was in his garage minding his own business when the police came and murdered him, was awarded $4. The family of Samuel DuBose received $4.8 million. But Ray Tensing, the cop who not only murdered the unarmed Samuel DuBose and was not convicted, received a settlement from the University of Cincinnati for almost $350,000. Not the family of Samuel DuBose. The cop who murdered him received the $350,000 as a settlement. Add to that Justine Damon, the white Australian woman who was shot by black police officer Muhammad Noor, who was convicted of third-degree murder and manslaughter and sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. Her family received $20 million in compensation, which even the mayor himself says is the highest settlement ever paid out in the state of Minnesota. And she wasn't even an American. Sandra Bland, murdered while incarcerated for the crime of not bowing down to a cop. Trooper Brian Encita was charged with perjury. The charges were later dropped. I'm always saying, though it may sound callous, and I just said it a little earlier, it happened yesterday, it happens today, and it will happen again tomorrow. I'm not in any way saying that these murders aren't something that we should not be outraged about. But I am saying that I truly wonder what it's going to take for our people to start realizing that the one and only solution for our people is separation from this system. For our safety, for our security, and for our sanity. We are ignored by the government we rail against, trying to somehow get them to recognize us as full citizens and actual human beings, while demanding reparations from the ones who not only put us in this position, but have, especially now, during this present situation, shown in no uncertain, unambiguous terms that they don't even give a tinker's damn about their own people or what they want, need, or demand. And somehow we think that we can make them listen to our demands or even care about them. And in the midst of it all, our people are being murdered in the streets by the likes of race soldier cops and race soldier civilians and barbecue Beckys and Karens who use them as their strong armed forces in order to get us killed or at the very least thrown in prison. Listen closely to the names of some of our fallen. Amadou Diallo, murdered by cops who fired 41 shots at him when he was holding a phone. Philando Castile, murdered by a cop after telling that cop that he legally had a weapon with him in his vehicle. Michael Brown, unarmed, murdered by cops. Trayvon Martin, murdered by race soldier George Zimmerman, who was not convicted. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, murdered by a cop within 2 seconds of when this race soldier got out of his car. 2 seconds. George Stinney Jr., 14 years old, murdered in South Carolina in the electric chair for no crime. Fred Hampton, assassinated as he slept beside his pregnant fiancée by the government. Tatiana Jefferson, murdered in her home by a cop who was supposed to be doing a wellness check. Ayanna Monet Stanley Jones, 7 years old, murdered by SWAT team. Eric Gardner, choked to death by cops, no officers charged.
Pamela Turner, unarmed, who should have gotten mental health services, was instead murdered by a cop. And there are more. These are the names of other unarmed black people murdered. Greg Gunn, no officers charged. Keith Childress, no officers charged. Betty Jones, no officers charged. Kevin Matthews, no officers charged. Michael Noel, no officers charged. Leroy Browning, no officers charged. Roy Nelson, no officers charged. Nathaniel Pickett, no officers charged. Tiara Thomas, officer charged with murder. Cornelius Brown, no officers charged. Jamar Clark, no officers charged. Richard Perkins, no officers charged. Michael Lee Marshall, no officers charged. Alonzo Smith, no officers charged. Anthony Ashford, no officers charged. Dominic Hutchinson, no officers charged. Lamontez Jones, no officers charged. Rayshawn Cole, no officers charged. Peterson Brown. Officer David Cobb was charged with involuntary manslaughter and served 3 months in jail.
Christopher Kimball, no officers charged. Junior Prosper, no officers charged. Keith McLeod, no officers charged. Wayne Wheeler, no officers charged. Levante Biggs, no officers charged. Navy veteran India Kager, in the car with her 4-month-old baby, cops shot into her car 30 times. No officers charged. Tyree Crawford, no officers charged. James Canary, no officers charged. Felix Kumi, no officers charged. Eshamis Manley, no officers charged. Christian Taylor, no officers charged. Troy Robinson, no officers charged. Brian Day, no officers charged. Michael Saby, no officers charged. Billy Ray Davis, no officers charged. Darius Stewart, no officers charged. Albert Davis, no officers charged. Salvador Ellswood, no officers charged. Jonathan Sanders, no officers charged. Freddie Blue, no officers charged.
Spencer McCain, no officers charged. Kevin Bajole, no officers charged. Zamil Crawford, no officers charged. Jermaine Benjamin, no officers charged. Chris Jackson, no officers charged. Kevin Higginbotham, no officers charged. Ross Anthony, no officers charged. Richard Gregory Davis, no officers charged. Curtis Jordan, no officers charged. Marcus Clark, no officers charged. Lorenzo Hazy, no officers charged. D'Angelo Stallworth, no officers charged. DeJuan Graham, no officers charged. Brandon Glenn, no officers charged. Reginald Moore, no officers charged. Nuna LaRoche, no officers charged. Jason Champion, no officers charged. Brian Overstreet, no officers charged. David Felix, no officers charged. Terry Lee Chapman, no officers charged. William Chapman, Officer Stephen Rankin charged and convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Samuel Harrell, no officers charged.
Freddie Gray, 6 officers were involved, 3 were charged with murder and were acquitted, and all charges were dropped against the remaining officers. Norman Cooper, no officers charged. Brian Acton, no officers charged. Darnell Brown, no officers charged. Frank Shepard III, no officers charged. Walter Scott, Officer Michael Slager, who shot Walter Scott in the back, was convicted of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice, and he received 20 years in prison. Donald Dante Ivy, no officers charged. Eric Harris, Deputy Bates, was charged with and convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Philip White, no officers charged. Dominic Wise, no officers charged. Jason Moland, no officers charged. Bobby Gross, no officers charged. Denzel Brown, no officers charged. Brandon Jones, no officers charged. Ascari Roberts, no officers charged. Terrence Moxley, no officers charged. Anthony Hill, no officers charged. Bernard Moore, the officer was charged with misdemeanor vehicular homicide. A mistrial was declared and the officer has yet to be convicted. Tony Robinson, no officers charged. Darnell Gatewood, no officers charged.
DeAndre Dorsey, no officers charged. Thomas Allen, no officers charged. Laval Hall, no officers charged. Calvin Reed, no officers charged. Gerdell Mose, no officers charged. Terry Price, no officers charged. Natasha McKenna, no officers charged. Jeremy Lett, no officers charged. Kevin Garrett, no officers charged. Alvin Haynes, no officers charged. Artajo Damon Howard, no officers charged. Tiano Matan, no officers charged. Andre Lerone Murphy Sr., no officers charged. Leslie Sapp, no officers charged. Brian Pickett, no officers charged. Frank Smart, no officers charged. Matthew Ajibade. Deputy Kinney was convicted of cruelty to an inmate, and Deputy Evans was convicted of public records fraud and 3 counts of perjury for killing Matthew. Deputy Kinney was sentenced to 1 year in jail to be served only on weekends and 3 years probation, while Deputy Evans was sentenced to 6 years probation.
These were all unarmed black people murdered by the police. If you're familiar with any of these names and have any more information on any charges that may have been brought or filed, please let me know. Or if any of them actually went to trial finally, let me know that and I'll update it. This list is what I have up to the present date. Now, this is a lot of black lives, isn't it? And guess what? All the names that you have just heard represent only 1 year. You heard me right. All of these names represent 1 year of black people, unarmed black people being murdered. We have got to separate. The act of separation doesn't have to come all at once, like ripping a bandage from a wound. It is a process, first mentally, but it must start somewhere. Let us begin in our mind and in our consciousness. Learn to love ourselves and love our people. Let it begin in the mind and then in the consciousness. Know where you are and with whom you're dealing. Thank you for listening to the Drapetomaniac podcast. This is Ayapo Yapa, the HDIC. That is the head Drapetomaniac in charge. And as always, I'll see you on the run.
And thank you again for listening to the Drapetomaniac podcast. Tune in next week at doiamedia.com. DOEAIAMEDIA.com. And again, we'll catch you on the run. Peace.